Let me come back to one of the difficulties that you mentioned earlier, which is around the availability of educational psychologists. And that is a problem because there is a requirement that an educational psychologist undertakes an assessment of the child as part of the education healthcare needs assessment process. So obviously, if there are not enough educational psychologists, I can see that's obviously going to impact on this timescales. Do you want to just tell us something about the capacity of the team there and what's happening?
Okay, so I'll just briefly contextualise it and then let Janine do the difficult bit and talk about what it looks like on the ground in North East. There's a national factor and there's a local factor as well. So nationally, there is a shortage of educational psychologists, and that's reflected in the DfE's change programme. So they're looking to make far more training places available for educational psychologists. That's not coming through very quickly, so we're not seeing any results of that, which is not surprising. It doesn't take a week to train an educational psychologist. We're talking about highly trained people here, so that will take time to come through. There is then a local context, so it is clear that Essex is one of the authorities that's struggling more than others, and some of that is due to competitive salaries that other local authorities locally might be paying. We are unfortunate in terms of our location next to the London boroughs, who are able to and do offer higher salaries. I think also a lot of educational psychologists want to do more than just needs assessments. You know, they want to use all of that training, all that knowledge and experience. That's potentially something that's not attractive to Essex. I also have to say, I think there is a factor of, there is a constant stream of negative stories about SEND, as you've just reflected on. And so it's not necessarily a service that you would want to come into at the moment and think that you were going to make a difference. And I think that's important.
Yeah, I was going to say that certainly educational psychologists that I know and have spoken to have reflected that it's definitely an issue about pay and conditions for them, where they can work independently and earn much more. And other local authorities have more of what they call a traded model, whereby they don't directly employ EPs, but they buy in the time of EPs that are working independently. So there's a much wider system problem, isn't there, around EPs? And
there is, and the market will respond to what it sees. So we do use something called associate EPs, which is our engagement with the independent market, and Janine knows far more about that, so I'll let her talk about it in a moment. But we have just managed to secure the funding to have a significant input from a independent company that will provide us with 900 needs assessments in a year. So that's going to help us significantly with those families who are waiting and have been waiting for some time for their young person to be seen by an EP.
That sounds like great news, really good. Janine, do you want to just say something about how that's going to impact us in the northeast of Essex, and what your plans are in terms of utilising that capacity?
So Ralph talked about Essex being split into 4 quadrants, which obviously in terms of a northeast picture. In a northeast picture, in terms of our own educational psychology workforce, we're in a much better position in terms of vacancies, or not as many vacancies than in some of the other quadrants. So we need to be and feel assured that we're sharing a resource across ECC, either with the contract that Ralph mentioned, but also with our associate workforce. I would just like to sort of also share that our educational psychologists have also been through some changes in terms of their own team leadership as well. Ralph mentioned the associate workforce. So the associate workforce that you shared before, so are educational psychologists that work independently but are supported through local authority approaches in terms of their induction and in terms of some CPD opportunities as well, so we can be really clear that EHC advice through associate EPs is in terms of the format and different things like that as well, and sort of access to our own provision understanding, such as ordinarily available and different things like that, that our associate EP workforce is also familiar with, which again is really positive. And as Ralph has said, our own EP workforce absolutely still focus and undertake earlier intervention with schools and with clusters of schools, and also with young people directly as well, and we don't want to lose that.
So I think what you've said there, Janine, is around, we're lucky in Colchester that we have a fantastic university, so you've kind of got a easy access in perhaps to a potential workforce there. Are you saying that in the North East we don't have such a big problem with recruiting EPs as they do in the rest of Essex for that reason?
At the moment, so yes, but that's not to say that we would have enough to meet the needs of the assessment increase. I'm certainly not suggesting that, but I'm suggesting that we need to look at our EP workforce in quadrants, but then across Essex as well. And some of our other quadrants have more EP vacancies. Again, as Ralph's mentioned, sometimes that is because they're neighbouring a different authority that may have a different sort of attraction as well.
So you have a blend of in-house directly employed EPs and EPs that are kind of brought in, but there's an induction process that means that they're aligned with the same working practices and skill set and knowledge about practices that are unique to Essex in this area, so that they work and produce work of the same standard in terms of the assessments. I mean, that they produce assessments that are equal.
And some of those people and indeed the workforce that Ralph was mentioning through that contract, we will be engaging with our families more around, and our schools more around remote assessments. We've completed very successful remote assessments for some times. Some of the families that you'll have been working with, Sue, will have had a remote assessment for their child.
Yeah, do you want to just describe that a little bit more, Janine, for those people watching this video that maybe don't know what that means?
I think that what we should absolutely say is that where an educational psychologist may have been initially invited to support a family remotely, and that it's felt that wouldn't be appropriate, that we would still be offering what we call a face-to-face assessment. We know that a lot of our families and schools are worried about remote assessments, but we've got lots of good evidence. There's a research piece from the Eastern region that certainly can demonstrate effective remote assessment work that has happened across the Eastern region and nationally. And many of our existing associates have also and continue to work remotely as well in support of assessment. So there's lots of ways of doing that. It's about collating good information. It's potentially about meeting a young person online if the young person is up to meeting the EP online. It is about through the power of technology, an EP being able to see through somebody else, so certainly in an early year setting, through an iPad, through one of the practitioners in the setting, observing a child, but through the lens of the technology as well. So there's quite a lot of ways. There's quite a lot of our cognitive assessments that can be done online as well, and supported online too. So it's going to be one of the ways that we'll be moving forwards, as well as is utilising more remote assessments.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Obviously, it takes less time, which is really the biggest barrier that we've spoken about here in terms of EP capacity. And also it's great to hear that where it's maybe the observations are that, okay, we're not going to get good information, there's still an option there for those face-to-face. So that's really good.
We're aware that we haven't shared sort of the crucial and effective information with families, so we are developing an information page for families and for schools around the use of EP assessments, including remote assessments. There'll be much more information for families at the point of the request, and we're just finalising that, so that will go to all families as well. But we'll also be linking back with the families on our current awaiting EP allocation list, and be sharing more rich information about remote assessments with them too.
So that information, will that also be made available on the Essex local offer? So anybody will be able to access that. So that would be great. Let me know when that's up, and then we can also share that link. Great. As we're recording this video, today has come out a news item that has broadcast that £1 million has been agreed to put into this issue around EHCP timelines and alleviate some of the capacity. Do you think you could just outline for us, what's the plan for spending that money, and how's that going to make improvements?
So I think there's two parts to this. I'll speak about one part, and then I'll hand over to Janine. If we just focused on one part, then what we could potentially have is a system where the percentage of children whose plans were complete in time improved rapidly, but we still had a significant number of young people who were still waiting, because you could focus all of your attentions on 50% of the children, and the other 50% were taking longer and longer to complete. So there's two halves to it. The first half is the announcement that's just been made about the investment in independent educational psychologists. So in the scrutiny committee, I was asked about what we were doing about EP capacity and whether we would use EPs that parents are commissioned, and my response was that we would prefer to do something on a larger scale, and that was the announcement that was made today because it was in process. We were going through the governance. We are investing through an independent private company to significantly increase EP capacity to address those who are in the backlog. So they will be focused entirely on those young people and parents who have been waiting a long time, to drive down that length of time that it's taking for those assessments to take. And then there'll be a separate plan as to how we improve timescales for new assessments. There is onward planning around what else we need to do additionally, and looking at capacity within the system as a whole. We are not quite ready there to be able to announce that, but we will of course soon come back to tell you about it. And there's also the work that's being done on the ground right here, right now by Janine and her colleagues in the SEND team. So do you want to just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, and again, that's sort of twofold as well. So in terms of the statutory assessment part, we talked about SEND operations and their roles, and the sort of 3 parts of the assessment process. So we've really looked at those 3 parts. We know them inside out and back to front, by the way.
And just to circle back to that, you're talking about the 6-week period.
That's right.
During which the local authority makes a decision about whether they will or won't undertake the assessment. The second phase, which is the assessment is undertaken, and the final phase, identifying the school placement, correct?
Yes. So, and the final phase is really important because it's actually once the authority has made the decision to issue an EHCP and issue a proposed or draft EHCP to final. So that's the decision making part, which comes after the assessment phase itself. So we've really looked in detail at all of those phases and been looking at our own data where Ralph talked about that a little bit. Where in the county are we seeing sort of spikes in some things taking a much longer time in some quadrants and other quadrants, and really analysing in a much more detailed way. I don't want people to think that we haven't been looking at that, by the way, but in a much more detailed way across the county, and then really looking at where we can make improvements. But of course, all of our improvements being in line with the Code of Practice and the SEND regulations. So again, some of our way of managing that will be absolutely with the family and the young person at the centre. That has not gone away. That is absolutely our attention. It's core to the Code of Practice, and it's core to what all of our staff believe. Ralph talked about that earlier. That has to be still at the core of what we do. But it's actually streamlining that process, so that the time taken for when all of the information and advice is in for a young person, it is as soon as that is in, a summary report will be gathered with all of the advice as well, and it's at that point that a decision will be made whether to issue an EHCP. Now, some of your families may not know what happens currently. Currently, we put together a needs assessment report and we share that with the family, and we may take some time to get that looking, or work with the family on that. We want to make it really clear for a family at the earliest point if we're issuing an EHCP, because we know that families have been waiting a long time. And then, as Ralph shared, different quadrants have been looking at their data in different ways. We've already shared in North East, we're absolutely aware that the stage from issuing a proposed to finalising an EHCP is slightly longer than other quadrants. We've really analysed why that might be. We've looked at everything that we do in terms of those processes, and we've already improved the weeks that it's taking to get to that point over the last 2 months already. So we're already driving towards making quicker decisions as well and streamlining that work.
And that's because you've streamlined it. What you're saying here is that within that section of assessment and issuing plan, that there would normally have been this needs assessment report, and then there's conversations about that, but instead of which you're going from assessment to draft plan to chop down that period of weeks and cut. So you're saying in the last 2 months you've made progress. Are you able to be more specific about how much progress or how many weeks have you cut that down by? I don't know if you've got anything to specify there.
It's difficult because I've been looking at our overall data to be able to sort of hone in on what might be difficult across a whole year. Yeah. But I can say that and it's still not hitting the mark in terms of number of weeks. Yeah. But we have reduced, or it looks like if we stay on track, we'll be reducing our average from proposed to final in North East by 4 weeks, which is significant because it should only take 4 weeks to get from proposed to final. So, and Ralph's outlined why some of those things have been difficult. So we are just being really clear with families at the point of agreeing to issue an EHCP, what that process is, what do we need from them, what dialogue are we having about their preferred school or at that particular point as well. So we're going to have a richer conversation with families at the point of telling a family we are issuing an EHCP, we're going to be sharing a proposed with you. So it's that conversation as well, and actually that's across Essex, that's not just North East, but that conversation at that point will be richer than it is now.
Thinking back about those 3 parts to this process, there's the first part, which is the 6 weeks that the local authority have to make a decision about whether to undertake the needs assessment. On average, is that 6 weeks? Are decisions being made within that 6-week period, or is there a delay in that also?
Across the county, it was a couple of months ago, and I apologise because I haven't got the key data, something like 95%. So we're talking
on time or missed?
On time.
Yeah.
On
okay.
time.
So that section.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we're still looking to improve that.
Of course.
By the way.
Middle section is the assessment and the issuing of the plan, isn't it? Which is obviously there's been this capacity issue around EPs. You've previously outlined capacity within the SEND operations team that you've described improvements in, and then the third part was about consultation with education settings, which I can see adds some delay because maybe that you're sending our plan out to an education setting that's saying no, we don't think we can meet needs, so that holds that up. But I think the overall summary is that it's that middle section of the needs assessment with the educational psychologists that is the main reason for this. I think it's also worth pointing out that, you know, we've had this like horror statistic about only 1% are being met within that statutory timeline. But if 99% of the EHCPs were completed within 22 weeks, that would still be 99% missed within the timeline, wouldn't it? So I think what would be really useful information for us within the parents community to know is over time, you've described all the work that's going on, for us to be having some kind of feedback about, okay, this term, what changes have been made? Because even if it's only from we're waiting on average 40 weeks to we're waiting on average 35 weeks or 30 weeks, you know, that still shows people that there is some progress and some hope about the situation improving. We've had a really comprehensive conversation here about how we've got to this situation. It's been great to hear all of the work that you're doing behind the scenes and what the plan is, and it will also be even better when we see the results of that. But of course, in the meantime, what we have is a lot of people waiting, families waiting, not knowing where they are on a waiting list, how long will it be? So have you had any thoughts about that in terms of what support is there for those families whilst waiting?
So we work in a system in the Eastern region of peer review, which started last year.
What does that mean?
So essentially we're working with other local authorities and parent carer forums across the Eastern region to look at how each of us works. Essex were part of reviewing some work in Norfolk, and then we volunteered to be the second authority that was part of that. And you get to choose as a local area what's the area of focus you want to have. And so we said we wanted the focus to be what additional support could be in place for parents, families, children, young people, for those who are in the needs assessment pathway or in the diagnostic pathway for autism and ADHD. So at the beginning of the year, we had a peer review team who came to visit Essex. They met a number of focus groups, including parent support groups.
And me.
And you,
I met them too.
And they met health practitioners and they met schools. And we weren't in the room when those conversations were taking place. So the courageous part of it is you invite people in to come and speak the truth, which is what we wanted to hear. Because if you just hear people telling you you're great, you're not going to change. So we wanted to get a clear steer on what else can we do. We've been given a clear set of recommendations which are helping to inform what we do next in terms of supporting both parents and families, but also supporting schools. And some of those recommendations are also to be shared with the school system itself about what they can do to support children and young people while they're in school and they're going through both of those processes.
So can we learn a bit more about, are you able to say what were some of the key points? And if you're not able to say that, where can we see that information?
We will quite happily distribute what those key recommendations were, and we are happy for you to share them on the Maze website, and we will also, I think, be putting them on the local offer if we haven't done already. I think important, it's not just what they've told us, it's what we do next, and that's part of the ongoing cycle of communication that we need to establish.
Okay, so I've got a note now to look that up and find out what that is, because I'll be interested to see that. Yeah, great. Janine, do you have anything to add here about support for families while they're waiting for the issue of the plan in terms of what's happening here in the northeast of Essex?
So as Ralph said, in terms of the courageous conversation work, we're all that courageous conversation outcome or asked us to look at in much more detail the families and the children that were waiting for EP allocation, therefore with EHC needs assessments that were delayed. So up to now, predominantly we've been allocating an educational psychologist in date order, so looking at those families that were waiting the longest. We are looking at much more of a sort of in-depth information about some of our children's and families' experiences currently, and we'll be sharing some updated information with the families on that list as well. So from a North East perspective, we'll be contacting families again who are already on that awaiting EP allocation list, and that's predominantly to update them, but also to check in with them, to, as we've shared before, to review their view about a remote assessment. So we'll be looking at how some of our other team members, such as our engagement facilitators as well, can be actively involved in supporting some of the families in a different way. As Ralph said, we'll also be relying on our schools to continue the support of those young people who are at school or at settings as well, through ongoing one planning. So you mentioned one planning already, through ongoing effective one planning through that assess, plan, do, review cycle too. So there's some of the things that we'll be doing in terms of supporting families whilst they're waiting for EP allocation as well.
So what I'm hearing you say is that you can see that families are needing more information and to have updates about where they are, and you've been thinking about who within the team that you oversee, including school settings that you don't oversee, but including them, how they can be instrumental in providing that feedback for families. And I'm just going to put it out there again on record that I think it would be great if there was an app where families could track their progress, where they are, and that they could also access information within the app that might help them while they're waiting, or to give them information about the process. So anybody watching this who's an app developer, that would be a great thing a project to move along with. That's great. The other thing, of course, that I've got in my mind, because of the work that I've been doing with families, is that there are some children and young people who are in a phase transfer, by which we mean maybe they're transferring from early years to primary school, primary to secondary, secondary into an FE setting, who are in this waiting period. And in Essex, we have this mechanism for additional top-up funding that's called IPRA, the Individual Pupil Resource Allocation. And obviously, I'm thinking for families, that's going to be an option for those people who don't have a finalised EHCP, but for the young person requires that additional level of support within the phase transfer. I don't know if that's something that you want to comment on?
Prior to now, schools and so let's say if it's an early years to school setting, we would be expecting it to be almost like a joint IPA request for an individual child. Well, actually, we know who those children are already. We've already agreed an assessment for those children. So we're going to be looking in North East a bit more pragmatically at who those children are, and linking back with the schools that those children are going into in terms of through the usual admissions process as well, and be really looking at that a bit more pragmatically, so it doesn't feel like we're jumping through another hoop. So that's certainly something that we're going to be doing in North East around that as well. So rather than waiting for more, I'm going to get paperwork to come in requesting IPRA, we'll be looking at that more pragmatically in terms of cohorts going into a particular school or setting. And then of course we absolutely want families to be aware, involved, etc. Around that.
So my question here, I'm thinking about the families I'm supporting and thinking, that's great, people are hearing you saying that. People have also had the experience of they're not hearing back from the SEND operations team. And that, of course, means that people lose faith that this work is going on. If people are concerned and they're not hearing anything, they don't know if this is going on, how can they get that information? What's the best route for them to take to get information about what's happening here?
Because we've wanted in North East our SEND operations coordinators to focus much more, as you've just said, on that second part of the assessment, particularly where we've got an EP allocated and we want to gather all of that rich information, contact the family back again, contact the school or the setting that child is in to see if there's any updated information at that particular point, and really ensure that the quality of any proposed plan issued is still of high quality. That's still our intention. So in North East Essex, we focused on one of our SEND operations assistants. So there'll be some direct contact there, but they can also contact our main SEND operations inbox in North East as well, and I'll share the details with you, Sue, so families have that as part of this video.
So obviously, if we're taking 30 weeks or 35 weeks to complete a needs assessment, that's a period of time at which a school should have expected to have had the funding in place, and they haven't. So at the moment, what we're doing is, at the point at which the plan is completed, we're backdating the funding to week 20. So the school or setting will know that they will be funded for that young person. However, we know that schools and our settings have got some particularly challenging financial situations themselves. So we are looking at ways in which we might be able to change that so that there is more support at an earlier stage in terms of the finances as well, so that schools are confident they've got the funding in place to be able to support the needs of the young person.
Well, listen, thank you both so much for coming to meet with me today and for your time and really taking the time to explain in detail what's happened, what you're working on. I know it's at a much more strategic level than people would normally see, but I think it's really helpful information. I think what's important for everybody watching this to know is that there's a lot of support available for you while you are waiting, if you're in this process or starting to think about this process. And in the northeast of Essex, we're lucky to have this early support pathway, and a lot of that support can be accessed via the coffee mornings that we hold. So we have our coffee mornings in Colchester, Clacton, Harwich and Mistley. There's always a number of professionals there. We always have our partners from Families in Focus there, the family support advisors that can give advice around this EHCP process and many other topics too. We have our team of May's emotional wellbeing practitioners. We recognise the emotional toll and the stress that this life can have upon our families. And then we have a number of other professionals that often come along, Autism Central. So there is lots of advice and support available. I think one of the areas that has been my focus has been around the quality and standard of one planning. I think there's an enormous amount of benefit in making sure that your child's one plan is really specific and really focused on the young person, the outcomes that we want to get from them. And you can get really good advice by coming along to our coffee morning sessions as well. Now, Ralph, you're coming along, aren't you, on May the 20th?
I am, yes.
To see us in Colchester. So come along on May the 20th. You'll have an opportunity to come and speak to Ralph, ask him any questions, raise any issues that you want to. If you're watching this video and you can't come to the meeting in Colchester on May the 20th, write your question or comment in the section below, and we'll make sure that Ralph gets those comments and questions, and we'll come back to him for answers.